Welcome to the Change Advisory Board, also known as the CAB Call. This podcast is brought to you by Nicholas King and Columbia Cloudworks. So usually when a system breaks, like a shattered arm or something, the X-ray is pretty clear, right?
Oh, yeah. Broken or not broken, it's binary.
Exactly. You look at that jagged white line on the film and the doctor just points and says, well, there's the problem. But what happens when, say, a multi-million-dollar software system crashes or an entire corporate structure starts collapsing?
Right, because then that diagnostic X-ray is suddenly clouded.
Yeah.
You've got human ego, you've got terrified engineers, and a CEO demanding that someone, like anyone, be fired immediately.
Yeah, the dynamic completely shifts. So today we are looking at the ultimate survival guide to finding the truth when human nature is practically begging everyone to lie.
And, it is the defining tension of any complex organization. We all crave that clean X-ray, that undeniable binary of what went wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
But uncovering the actual mechanical truth of a failure is incredibly difficult when the people involved are just terrified of the consequences. The moment you introduce blame, the truth basically vanishes.
Which is why we're taking a radically different approach for this deep dive today. We're going to explore the ultimate power of truth, like truth with a capital T.
I love this approach, unpacking it from the ground up.
Right. And we're going to trace it through a really fascinating hierarchy of sources. We're starting with our foundational anchors, which are ancient religious texts from the Persian Empire. Then we move into the highly secretive, codified Masonic rituals of the 18th century that actually preserved those ancient ideas.
Which sounds like a leap, but it makes total sense when you look at the architecture of it all.
Exactly. And from there, we're going to use that exact historical and Masonic framework to evaluate how we operate today. We'll look at modern tech cultures, specifically SRE or software reliability engineering, and single source of truth databases.
And then wrapping it up with the psychology of why our society is just so utterly obsessed with finding scapegoats.
Yes. So what's great about this specific stack of material is that it forces us to establish a baseline. We aren't just looking at modern corporate behaviors in a vacuum,
Right. By using the religious and the Masonic texts as these objective anchor truths, we can explicitly analyze modern software philosophies and psychological behaviors, too.
We're essentially asking, how does a modern cloud computing company's desperate quest for data consistency map directly onto a philosophical debate held in a Persian court like 2.5 millennia ago?
It sounds wild, but the parallels are mind-blowing.
So let's just step right into that court. We are starting at the very top of our source hierarchy with the apocryphal book of 1 Esdras, specifically chapters 3 and 4.
To really grasp the stakes here, you have to look at the landscape of the ancient world at that time.
Right. Set the scene for us.
So it's during the reign of Darius. He's the king of Persia. The Babylonian captivity has already happened. Jerusalem is completely in ruins, and the Jewish people are desperately trying to rebuild their temple. But all the political work is just totally stalled.
Stalled out completely. And in the middle of this massive geopolitical anxiety, we find ourselves inside the opulent Persian court for what's known as the immemorial discussion.
The environment here is it's everything. King Darius isn't just a leader. He represents the ultimate, terrifying temporal power of that age. His word dictates life and death.
War and peace, yeah. And the narrative describes this scenario where 3 young guards who are protecting the king's chambers while he sleeps decide to hold this intellectual contest.
Which is a bold move for some guards.
Right. They agree to each write down a single sentence stating what they believe is the strongest, most powerful force in the entire world. And they just slip these sentences under the king's pillow.
The wager is crazy, too.
Yeah.
Whoever writes the wisest statement will be awakened by the king, draped in purple, and given massive wealth and honor.
It's essentially the highest stakes essay contest in all of antiquity. So Darius wakes up, finds these writings, and rather than just reading them privately, he turns it into a massive public spectacle.
Of course he does. He summons the princes, the rulers, the military captains, basically the entire machinery of the empire.
And he commands the guards to present their arguments publicly. And this debate over what holds the most powerful sway over mortals is so fascinating, because you can literally see these exact same arguments happening in modern boardrooms today.
Oh, absolutely. So the first guard steps up to the center of the court and he argues for the strength of wine.
Which, okay, on the surface, that might sound strange to modern ears as an argument for ultimate power. Like, wine? Really?
Right, but the guard actually makes a profound psychological observation. The text states that wine leads astray the minds of all who drink it. He argues that wine is the strongest force because it is the great eraser of reality.
Oh, wow. The great eraser. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, it equalizes the absolute monarch and the orphan child, the slave and the free. When humans drink, they experience this chemical subversion of reason. They forget their crippling debts, they forget their sorrows.
But crucially, they also forget their allegiances. The text specifically notes that wine causes men to draw swords in drunken, irrational fury against their own closest friends.
Exactly, only to wake up later with zero memory of the violence they committed. It's wild.
It's the intoxicating power of escapism. Wine represents pure physical appetite and the human desire to just check out of reality entirely.
But the crowd isn't entirely sold on this, so the second guard steps up. And he really plays to the room. He argues for the power of the king.
Smart move when the king is literally sitting right there.
Very smart. He points directly at Darius and says, "Gentlemen, are not men strongest who rule over land and sea, but the king is stronger."
So this is an argument for structural physical dominance. The king represents the ultimate, unquestionable legal and military authority over the physical world.
And his logic is brutal, but effective. He says if the king commands men to make war, they march off and die. If he tells them to level a mountain or build a city, they just do it.
They surrender all the spoils of their labor to him. They risk their lives unquestioningly to protect his borders. It is the absolute terrifying power of top-down mandate.
And then the third guard steps forward. This is Zerubbabel. He's a prince of the house of Judah.
And he's the guy who has a vested interest in getting permission to rebuild that ruined temple back in Jerusalem. So his rhetorical strategy here has to be incredibly bold.
And it is. He doesn't just give one answer. He delivers this two-part argument.
Yeah.
First, he completely undercuts the second guard by pivoting to the influence of women.
Right. He looks around this room full of these hyper-masculine military commanders and points out that, hey, women gave birth to the king, they gave birth to the armies.
He argues that men will abandon their parents, betray their countries, and surrender all their hoarded gold just to cleave to a woman.
The audacity of this moment cannot be overstated. Zerubbabel actually uses a specific living example right in front of the entire Persian court.
Oh, the concubine story. It's so good.
He says he personally witnessed the great King Darius himself sitting with his concubine, Apame. He watched her physically take the royal crown off the absolute monarch's head, put it on her own, and slap the king's face.
And Darius just smiled and begged for her affection. I mean, he is telling the most powerful man on earth, your temporal military power is entirely subservient to a deeper biological and emotional foundation.
It is a total mic drop moment. He establishes that emotion and biology trump military mandate. But he doesn't stop there. He delivers the climax of the entire debate.
Right. After proving that even the king bows to emotion, he pivots one final time to the absolute strength of the divine. He argues for the sovereignty of truth.
The text quotes him directly here. He says, "Truth is great and stronger than all things. It endures and is strong forever and lives and prevails forever and ever."
And notice how he systematically dismantles the previous arguments. He argues that wine is wicked, meaning it's fleeting and destructive. The king is wicked, women are wicked, and all the children of men are wicked.
Wait, so in this context, wicked doesn't mean evil, it means
subject to decay, prone to error, and ultimately mortal. But truth has no partiality. It does not play favorites.
the text actually says it remains unrighteous in its judgment, which is this archaic way of saying it cannot be bribed, it cannot be intimidated by a king's sword, and it cannot be swayed by emotional attachments.
Exactly. It's the only force that exists entirely independent of human fragility.
The court's reaction is just explosive. The crowd erupts and they start shouting a phrase that is going to be the anchor for the rest of our deep dive today. Magna est veritas, et prevalebit. Great is truth, and it will prevail.
Zerubbabel absolutely wins the contest. And Darius is so moved that he actually grants the request to return the stolen holy vessels and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem.
The underlying mechanism of why truth wins this debate is critical for everything we're going to unpack today. Wine wears off, kings die or they're overthrown, human passions fade.
But objective reality remains exactly what it is. A collapsed bridge is a collapsed bridge, regardless of how the king feels about it.
Right. Truth is the almighty sovereign force of the universe because it does not require your belief to actually exist.
So let's translate this. Let's pull this out of ancient Persia and put it into a modern corporate boardroom clash. Because I really see this exact dynamic playing out today.
Totally. You have executives sitting around a table arguing over what actually drives the company. Are they fueled by wine, by which I mean the intoxicating corporate perks, the blind momentum?
Oh, those euphoric, drunken hype cycles where everyone forgets their actual responsibilities just because the stock price went up yesterday?
Yes. Or are they driven by the king, the CEO's absolute unquestionable mandate? That sheer top-down temporal power where employees just blindly execute orders even if they know the product architecture is completely unstable.
Or is it women and emotion, like the emotional marketing, the brand loyalty, the attempt to psychologically manipulate consumer desire?
That is the exact modern translation. Every single company wrestles with those three false idols.
But then Zerubbabel, who, in a modern context might be the lead systems engineer or the data scientist, walks into that boardroom.
And he says no. The only thing that actually sustains us, the only thing that prevents this entire enterprise from burning to the ground, is the raw objective truth of our data and our systems.
Because you can have the most visionary CEO, the most aggressive sales team, and the most viral emotional marketing campaigns in the world. But if your underlying system telemetry is false,
The entire building falls down.
exactly. And that realization, that objective truth, is the only sustainable foundation for human endeavor, was considered so vital that it couldn't just be left as a neat story in an ancient text.
Right. If you want a concept like that to survive the rise and fall of empires, you have to engineer a way to preserve it. Which brings us to the fascinating historical bridge of the Masonic sources.
Where this specific triumph of truth was meticulously codified into a ritualistic system.
So Zerubbabel wins in antiquity. But ideas fade, right? Human nature creeps back in over time. How do you take a philosophical victory about truth and actually hard-code it into human behavior so it survives for centuries?
That was the exact engineering problem the Freemasons seemingly tried to solve. We are looking specifically at the illustrious Order of the Red Cross, which is a foundational order within the American York Rite.
And the source material points to Thomas Smith Webb, who synthesized this in his 1797 Freemasons Monitor.
Thomas Smith Webb was essentially an organizational architect. The late 18th century was this period of immense structuring within fraternal organizations. Webb took disparate floating legends and degrees and wove them into a highly coherent narrative technology.
A narrative technology, I love that framing. So for the York Rite, the Order of the Red Cross solves a very specific, glaring structural problem. It acts as a narrative and theological bridge.
Right, and I want to make sure I'm getting this structural problem right, because it sounds like total narrative whiplash for the participants.
It really was. The sources explain that the Masonic journey up to this point, specifically Royal Archmasonry, is deeply, heavily focused on the Old Testament. The candidate spends all this time conceptually rebuilding the physical Temple of Solomon.
But the ultimate destination in this specific rite is the chivalric orders. The Knights Templar, which is entirely New Testament and explicitly Christian.
You have a candidate who has spent their entire journey embedded in an ancient Jewish narrative, and suddenly they're supposed to become a medieval Christian knight. How did they bridge that gap without completely breaking the immersion?
That was exactly the critique raised by scholars of the time. Figures like Sir George S. Blackie pointed out the jarring inconsistency of dropping a candidate directly from a Jewish Sanhedrin, like a strict ancient legal council, into a Christian chivalric order. It made no sense.
So the Order of the Red Cross was utilized at the transition layer. It physically and psychologically takes the candidate, who is playing the role of Zerubbabel, on that perilous journey to the Persian court to debate King Darius.
The ritual argues that the implicit truth found in Judaism serves as a developmental schoolmaster that eventually ripens into the explicit truth of Christianity.
It bridges the ancient concept of the Jehovah of Israel to the Blessed Emmanuel of the New Testament, using this universal, unassailable concept of the God of truth as the connecting tissue.
It's like a master API in software engineering.
Yeah.
Or a legacy system migration.
Oh, that's a perfect analogy. It takes the operating system of the Old Testament, processes it through the universal algorithm of truth, and outputs it into a format that the New Testament chivalric orders can actually read and execute.
They literally used truth as the universal data format that both vastly different systems could perfectly understand.
But it's like an API with a crucial psychological difference. An API just passively passes data back and forth. This Masonic ritual actively compels the user to change their moral operating system to read that data.
And to ensure that this moral operating system wasn't corrupted, the ritualists built an incredibly robust user interface, like a symbolic architecture, around it. They standardized these symbols heavily in the 1892 Denver revision.
So what was the UI of this ritual? Let's break down the mechanics of these symbols because they aren't just decorations, right? They're functioning psychological tools. First, the material focuses heavily on the banner of the order.
Yeah, the banner is green, representing immortal green and hope. It's designed to evoke the memory of those who fall defending a just cause and the persistent hope of systemic restoration.
And at the very center of that green banner is a seven-pointed star of gold. And embedded inside that star is the core executable command. Magna est Veritas et prevalebit.
Great is truth, and it will prevail. It's a visual anchor.
And then there's the jewel of the order, which is a blood-red cross with equal arms. On the four extremities of this cross are the letters D, T, J, and L.
Those four letters are the core operating principles that the candidate is forced to internalize: deity, truth, justice, and liberty.
The texts emphasize that deity signifies the recognition of the ultimate God of truth. Truth itself is the central almighty force. But the last two are where it really becomes actionable.
Right. Justice is defined explicitly as truth applied to human affairs. You cannot have justice based on a lie. It must be equitable and based on objective reality.
And liberty is the freedom of the human spirit from the bondage of unrighteousness or falsehood. True liberty only exists when truth and justice are functioning properly.
There's also the physical bridge itself, which separates the Jewish and Persian apartments in the staging of the ritual. The bridge features the letters LDP.
LDP stands for Liberté de Passer, or Liberty of Passage. The prominent Masonic philosopher Albert Pike interpreted this deeply as the liberty of thought, speech, and action.
It represents the profound freedom that knowledge or objective truth grants us. Crossing that bridge in the ritual represents a treacherous, terrifying journey from the safety of captivity into the dangerous realm where you are forced to speak truth to absolute power.
Which brings us to the final, and I think probably the most important tool, the sword. Zerubbabel is given a sword for his journey across this bridge, but the monitorial instructions are incredibly strict about the mechanics of how this sword is used.
It is absolutely not a weapon of aggression.
Never. It is strictly an instrument to defend truth. The ritual dictates a formal vow. A true companion of the Red Cross will never draw his sword in the cause of injustice, falsehood, or oppression.
The instruction is just incredibly vivid. It tells the candidate to let the sword remain in its scabbard until it is literally consumed by rust, rather than draw it even once in the cause of falsehood.
This is the part that fascinates me. This isn't just a pledge to be a good person. This is a formal, psychological vow of extreme impartiality. You are swearing to protect the objective truth, even if that truth goes against your own king, your own company, or your own personal safety.
So looking at this through our analytical lens, how does this specific ancient vow set a psychological baseline for evaluating the modern tech and corporate sources we're about to dive into?
It establishes the absolute baseline that the pursuit of truth requires the total, ruthless suppression of human ego. It requires the rejection of punitive, emotionally driven reactions.
Right. If you draw your sword, meaning if you use your administrative power, your voice, or your influence to defend a lie, or to unjustly attack a subordinate just to protect your own reputation,
You are violating the fundamental architecture of organizational resilience. The Masonic sources argue that truth is divine and impartial. Therefore, if our human systems are going to survive, they must also strive for absolute impartiality.
you cannot punish people for telling you the bad news.
Right.
And you cannot incentivize people to hide the truth just to avoid the wrath of the king.
Which brings us right to the doorstep of the modern digital age. We've seen how deeply the concept of truth was venerated as a divine, impartial force in antiquity and in the Masonic lodges. Now let's look at how modern primary texts attempt to build literal, functioning temples to this exact concept inside server farms and corporate networks.
We're shifting down our hierarchy to the primary tech and business sources. Specifically, we are examining the KPI fire documentation regarding the necessity of a single source of truth, or SSOT.
And alongside that, we are analyzing the foundational primary texts from the field of site reliability engineering, or SRE, regarding the implementation of blameless postmortems.
Let's start with the database side, the SOT. When I first read the KPI fire material, what really struck me is that it doesn't define an SOT as just a piece of software or a specific server rack. It literally calls it a state of being for a company's data.
And that phrasing, state of being, is a direct echo of the Masonic idea of truth as an all-encompassing, undeniable reality. In modern enterprise architecture, achieving an SOT means aggregating data from dozens of disparate, often conflicting systems into one centralized location.
It rests on four non-negotiable principles:
Yeah.
centralization, consistency, accessibility, and scalability.
The text issues a massive, blinking red warning light here. It says that having multiple versions of the truth floating around a company leads to total paralysis and catastrophic decision-making.
It states, in no uncertain terms, that data isn't political and alternative facts are not acceptable.
Let's break down why that paralysis happens. Imagine a scenario. The marketing department's dashboard says they generated $10 million in revenue last quarter. The engineering department's dashboard says server costs $9 million of that.
But the C-suite is looking at a totally different, manually updated spreadsheet that says they are highly profitable.
The organization is functionally paralyzed. They are speaking different languages and living in alternate realities. The SSOT is designed to force every single ego in the building to bow to the exact same set of objective facts.
It aggressively strips away the ability to manipulate data for political gain or departmental survival.
If a company has siloed, contradictory data, it's essentially the exact same scenario as the scattered captive Jewish tribes in Babylon from our first source. Without a unified temple, without a single source of truth, everyone is operating in the dark.
And when you operate in the dark, you are vulnerable to whoever have the loudest voice. Without an SSOT, the executive with the most aggressive personality wins the argument, not the engineer with the actual facts.
That's a highly accurate assessment, but establishing an SSOT for your data is actually the easy part. It's just code.
The terrifyingly difficult part is figuring out how to extrapolate this data philosophy to human systems. How do you get terrified, self-preserving humans to actually input the unvarnished truth into that system?
Especially right after they just accidentally deleted the production database. That is where the primary sources on-site reliability engineering come into play, specifically the strict methodology of blameless postmortems.
Right. Let's walk through the mechanics of a failure. Say a massive cloud computing platform goes down, millions of dollars are vaporizing by the minute. The natural, instinctual human reaction is to find out who typed the wrong command and fire them immediately.
But the SRE texts argue that if you actually want to achieve a single source of truth after a failure, the engineers must feel entirely psychologically safe. Because if they are terrified, their amygdala fires. They enter fight-or-flight mode, and they will lie to survive.
And the second they lie, your precious SSOT is corrupted with false data. So, a blameless postmortem is a highly controlled, formal process designed to identify the systemic factors that led to an incident, while completely banning the act of pointing fingers at individuals.
It operates on a crucial assumption. Every engineer acted with the best intentions, based on the information they had available to them at that specific moment in time.
When you look at the rulebook for a blameless meeting in these sources, it is intensely, strictly controlled. It's practically a modern ritual.
The linguistics are heavily policed. You are explicitly instructed to ask how and what, and you are forbidden from asking why and who.
We have to look at the neurology and psychology of those specific words. When you ask someone, why did you do that? You are putting them instantly on the defensive. You're asking them to justify their character and their intelligence.
When you ask who caused this, you are openly hunting for a scapegoat. The brain perceives both of those as mortal threats.
But if you change the vocabulary to, how did the system fail? Or what processes were missing? You bypass the brain's threat detection system entirely.
You are asking them to describe the mechanics of the failure as an objective observer, rather than defending themselves as a suspect.
The sources also mandate using we instead of you. So instead of a manager pointing across the table and saying, you didn't check the backbone components before deployment, they're forced to say, we missed a critical step in the testing phase.
And the facilitator has to use affirming language to actively make people comfortable sharing the exact details of their massive mistakes.
What you are looking at is the modern corporate execution of the Red Cross vow. The engineers are consciously putting away their swords.
They are refusing to draw the sword of blame because drawing that sword serves the cause of injustice and falsehood. It forces people to hide the very data you need to fix the system.
By mandating absolute blamelessness, the organization is making a profound declaration. Discovering the objective truth is vastly more important to our survival than the momentary emotional satisfaction of punishing a scapegoat.
Okay, having established these modern tools, the SSOT for raw data and the blameless postmortem for navigating human error, we are now turning to the secondary analyses.
This is where the synthesis really crystallizes. This is where we see exactly how these modern engineering frameworks map directly one-to-one back to the court of King Darius.
We are diving into the article Blameless Postmortems, Culture over Scapegoats, and the Text Analyzing Systems of Retribution.
These secondary sources are the bridge. They explicitly connect the ancient narrative of Esdras with modern organizational psychology. The text actually walks us through an exact metaphorical mapping, taking the historical figures and placing them directly into a modern tech outage scenario.
Let's break down this mapping for the listener. In the modern corporate ecosystem, King Darius represents the executive board or the C-suite.
Yes, Darius is the entrenched temporal power structure. He holds the modern equivalent of life and death over the employees, their livelihoods, their careers, their health insurance.
He can command the company to build or destroy, to pivot or lay off thousands, just as the second guard argued in antiquity.
And Zerubbabel, the prince who stood up and argued for the absolute sovereignty of truth, represents the SRE, the site reliability engineer, or the incident commander managing the outage.
The SRE is the individual who steps into the boardroom, the modern Persian court, while the servers are literally still smoking. And the key is that they don't bring excuses, they don't bring the wine of corporate spin.
And they absolutely do not bring a sacrificial junior developer to appease the angry king. They bring the unvarnished DTJL standard of objective truth. They bring the raw telemetry, the server logs, the exact, unalterable timeline of events.
And finally, the holy vessels. The sacred artifacts that Zerubbabel wants to rescue from captivity and return to the temple. In this mapping, those vessels represent system integrity.
Correct. The holy vessels are the core stability, the reliability, and the trust in the platform. And the secondary texts make a critical argument here. Those vessels can only be restored when truth is spoken directly to power.
If the SRE alters the incident timeline to protect a friend who made a mistake, or if the C-suite demands a head on a platter rather than actually fixing the brittle code base, the vessels remain in captivity. The system remains fundamentally broken and will inevitably fail again.
I'm getting the full weight of this. Essentially, an exhausted SRE walking into a high-stakes post-mortem meeting armed with nothing but raw server logs is literally Zerubbabel stepping into the Persian court.
They aren't asking for heads to roll. They are simply laying the data on the table and proving that the objective truth of the system's architecture is stronger and more important than the CEO's bruised ego.
That is the exact dynamic. But for that dynamic to work, it requires a massive, painful psychological shift in how leadership views failure. The secondary sources discuss this as the evolution from the old view of human error to the new view.
The old view is essentially the bad apple theory. It operates on the assumption that the system itself is perfectly safe and well-designed, but unreliable, careless humans introduce errors into it.
Therefore, the logical solution is to find the bad apple, punish them, and fire them to restore the system.
But the new view, which the text draws from safety researchers like Sidney Dekker, flips that completely upside down. It argues that human error is almost never the root cause of a failure. Rather, human error is merely a symptom of deep systemic flaws.
The system is inherently complex, brittle, and full of traps, and the human operator is just the unlucky person who happened to be holding the hot potato when the music finally stopped.
To illustrate how difficult it is to shift from the old view to the new view, the sources use a massive historical prototype. The 1981 resolution on CPC history in China, which took place after the devastation of the Cultural Revolution.
The text extracts 4 crucial lessons from this historical pivot, demonstrating the psychology of forgiving massive errors on a national scale in order to rebuild. First, you must acknowledge the magnitude of the loss.
Without a frank, painful admission of failure, there is no foundation for truth. Second, you must separate the core mission from the specific error. You have to preserve the organization's identity while ruthlessly auditing its past mistakes.
Third, restore the status of the experts. End the ideological war on expertise and bring the technical people, the engineers, the scientists, back into the absolute center of decision-making.
And fourth, adopt what the text calls epistemological pragmatism, which basically translates to seeking truth from facts, prioritizing actual reality over ideological purity or reputational consistency.
When you analyze these secondary sources, you realize how heavily they rely on the Masonic anchor we discussed earlier. A properly executed blameless postmortem is the real-world, corporate execution of the DTJL standard.
Deity, or the ultimate objective reality of the system, is respected above all. Truth is the sole, uncompromising objective of the meeting.
Justice is applied systemically, fixing the environment rather than punitively firing the operator. And liberty is achieved when engineers are finally free to innovate without the paralyzing fear of retribution.
It strips away the intoxicating wine of public outrage and neutralizes the tyrannical king of executive ego, forcing every single person in the room to bow to the data.
But what happens when we refuse to bow to the data? What happens when human nature takes over, the ego wins, and we abandon this Masonic anchor of truth?
That brings us to the final tier of our source hierarchy. The opinion pieces exploring the incredibly dark side of human behavior, specifically focusing on false accountability and the scapegoat phenomenon.
This is where we examine society's active deviation from these ideals. The opinion sources offer a really sharp, cynical critique of what they term the false culture of accountability.
And to be clear, as we dive into this, we are impartially reporting the viewpoints presented in these opinion pieces as examples of this cultural critique. We aren't endorsing them, we are just analyzing them.
Right. The sources argue that the general public often mistakenly equates the word accountability with prison sentences and severe visible punishment.
The author argues that true systemic rot is almost always ignored while the public pays for individual blood. The text specifically uses a few provocative examples.
Like multi-million-dollar corporations receiving microscopic slap-on-the-wrist fines for massive data breaches, or what the author views as the outright contempt shown by the legal system in the burial of the Epstein client files.
The source uses these specific flashpoints to argue that this theater of false accountability breeds deep societal cynicism.
The core psychological argument of the opinion piece is profound. Society uses punishment not to uncover truth, but to discharge pain.
The text draws heavily on the anthropological philosophy of René Girard and Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1. Girard's central concept is mimetic imitation and the scapegoat mechanism.
When a community, whether it's an ancient tribe, a modern corporation, or a society on Twitter, experiences a crisis or a massive failure, the internal tension becomes unbearable.
To restore a false sense of communal peace, the community unconsciously colludes to single out a victim, a scapegoat. They load all the sins of the broken system onto this one individual, expel them, and suddenly the tension dissipates.
The text includes this amazing analogy from the writer Guido Viziello to explain this. He says we treat real life like an Agatha Christie detective novel.
It's a perfect metaphor. Think of the structure of a classic murder mystery. A peaceful community is disrupted by a horrific crime. The tension rises. Everyone is a suspect. Everyone is anxious.
The only way to resolve the narrative tension and restore peace to the village is for the brilliant detective to find the single evil culprit, expose them, and expel them from the community.
Once the murderer is led away in handcuffs, everyone else is magically absolved. The system is deemed safe again, and the story ends happily.
But the reality is, complex systems aren't Agatha Christie novels. If a massive cloud network like AWS goes down, taking half the internet with it, it's almost never because one evil villain decided to maliciously unplug a server.
There is no butler who did it in the library with the candlestick. In reality, the candlestick was a latency issue, the library was a misconfigured load balancer, and the real culprit was a cascade of latent failures, terrible UI design, rushed deployment schedules ordered by the C-suite, and exhausted, underpaid engineers.
But we still demand the Agatha Christie ending. We want the catharsis of seeing the junior developer who pushed the button publicly fired.
We demand it because it is cognitively easier. Facing the reality of a fundamentally broken system is terrifying. Firing one person is easy. The opinion sources break down the specific cognitive biases that our brains use to prevent us from achieving a blameless culture.
The first is the fundamental attribution error. This is our brain's tendency to believe that a failure reflects a person's inherently bad character or gross negligence, rather than acknowledging the incredibly complex, trap-filled circumstances they were operating under.
Then there's confirmation bias. Once the mob decides someone is to blame, we only look for data that supports their guilt. We actively ignore all the systemic data that proves the system was a ticking time bomb waiting for anyone to trip the wire.
Next is hindsight bias. After a catastrophic failure occurs, we look back at the timeline and say, it was so obvious this was going to happen, you should have known.
But that's an illusion. In the moment before the failure cascaded, it wasn't obvious at all to the operator.
And finally, negativity bias, where we focus so heavily on the one single action that went wrong that we completely ignore the thousands of times that same engineer navigated a broken system to keep it running perfectly.
If we take these opinion pieces and we look at them through the Masonic lens we established in Section 2, the contrast is incredibly stark.
It is the absolute terrifying antithesis of the Red Cross ideal. When a culture becomes punitive, when it actively craves a scapegoat to satisfy its cognitive biases and discharge its pain, the natural human survival instinct kicks in.
The engineers will hide the truth. They will delete the server logs. They will point fingers at other departments to save themselves. They will quietly let the system burn to the ground as long as they aren't the ones left holding the match.
In strict Masonic terms, demanding a scapegoat is drawing your sword in the cause of injustice and falsehood. It is yielding to the fear of the king rather than having the courage to stand up for the truth.
Hold on, if we demand a scapegoat just to feel avenged, aren't we acting exactly like the drunken men in the strength of wine argument from one Esdras?
We are literally intoxicated by our own outrage. We're striking blindly with our swords at our own brothers, getting that hit of dopamine from the punishment, while the actual broken system continues to operate right under our noses, completely unfixed.
That is the exact fatal danger. You get the momentary emotional high of the firing, the rush of the wine, the illusion of the Agatha Christie ending, but the truth remains buried. The systemic rot remains untouched, and the system is mathematically doomed to fail again.
So let's tie this entire deep dive together. We started our journey in the ancient, opulent court of King Darius, where a lone prince named Zerubbabel proved that the sovereignty of objective truth outlasts the intoxicating power of wine, the terrifying temporal dominance of kings, and the deep, manipulative influence of human emotion.
We saw how Thomas Smith Webb and the early Masonic ritualists meticulously codified that ancient victory into the illustrious Order of the Red Cross. They engineered a psychological translation layer that demanded absolute impartiality, swearing its members to keep their swords sheathed rather than defend a falsehood.
We then traced that exact same philosophy, that exact same desperate need for objective reality, straight into the modern digital age. We saw how the necessity for a single source of truth in our enterprise databases is a direct attempt to banish alternative facts and political manipulation from the boardroom.
We examined the site reliability engineering practice of blameless postmortems, recognizing it not just as an HR policy, but as the modern, high-stakes execution of the Red Cross vow, a system meticulously designed to strip away the ego of the CEO and the terror of the engineer, forcing everyone to look solely at the objective telemetry.
And finally, we look at the dark side of our own human nature, analyzing opinion sources that warn us about the deeply ingrained scapegoat phenomenon. We saw that a false culture of accountability, driven by our cognitive biases and our desperate desire for an easy Agatha Christie ending, utterly destroys psychological safety and guarantees that the truth will be buried.
Whether it's a Persian king in antiquity commanding an empire, or a modern C-suite executive staring down a massive server outage, truth remains the almighty sovereign force. You can fight it, you can hide it, you can fire people to cover it up, but eventually reality wins.
The system crashes. A culture of punishment builds fragile, doomed systems. A culture of truth builds resilient ones.
The hierarchy of sources we've examined makes it undeniably clear. The moment you prioritize your ego, office politics, or the emotional release of vengeance over objective reality, you lose the holy vessels, you lose your system integrity, and you lose the future.
The sources reveal a profound warning. When a system is governed by fear and punishment, the people inside it will inevitably cover their tracks, delete the logs, and stay perfectly silent while the building burns around them.
So look at your own life, your workplace, your family, your relationships. If truth is truly the almighty force that outlasts empires, what logs are you currently hiding? Because you are treating the people around you like a punitive King Darius, rather than trusting in the ultimate prevailing power of truth.